March 19, 1945. The transport truck rattled through the gates of Camp Shelby in rural Mississippi, carrying 43 female prisoners of war who had long ago stopped believing in mercy. Greta Hoffman pressed her face against the wooden slats, watching pine trees blur past with the dull curiosity of someone who had forgotten what it meant to care about anything beyond survival. At 24 years old, she had already lived through lifetimes of hunger, fear, and the peculiar numbness that comes from watching everything you believed in crumble into ash and lies. The women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms hanging loose on frames that had been whittled down by years of rationing that had turned into starvation. Greta could count the ribs of the woman sitting beside her through her uniform. They all could. In the final months before their capture in France, their daily ration had consisted of one slice of black bread, occasionally supplemented with watery soup that contained more hope than actual vegetables. The bread itself had become progressively darker and grittier as Germany ran out of wheat and began adding sawdust and ground chestnuts to stretch what little grain remained. Greta's stomach had stopped growling months ago. That was the strange thing about real hunger. At first, your body screams for food constantly. Then, after weeks and months of deprivation, it goes quiet. The gnawing pain becomes a constant companion you learn to ignore, like the ringing in your ears after artillery fire. You forget what it feels like to be full. You forget that food can taste like anything other than dust and desperation. She remembered her mother's kitchen in Hamburg before the war, the smell of braised pork and roasted potatoes, the way butter melted on fresh bread, golden and impossibly rich. Her mother's specialty had been cabbage rolls, tender leaves wrapped around seasoned beef and rice, swimming in a tomato sauce that made the whole apartment smell like comfort itself. Greta could close her eyes and still see her mother's hands, strong and sure, rolling each one with practiced precision. That was another lifetime, another world. Hamburg was rubble now, and Greta had no idea if her mother had survived the firebombing that had consumed the city. The truck jerked to a stop, throwing the women forward. An American soldier opened the back gate, and Greta caught her first real look at the camp that would be her prison. She expected something harsh and punishing. Instead, she saw neat barracks, green grass, and guards who looked almost bored rather than cruel. The air smelled different here, clean. There was food cooking somewhere, she could tell. The scent was faint, but unmistakable. Her stomach, so long silent, suddenly twisted with a pain so sharp it made her gasp. One of the other women, Elsa, grabbed her arm. "Did you smell that?" she whispered, in German. Greta nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They had learned not to hope. Hope was more dangerous than hunger. The American camp commander, a broad-shouldered woman named Captain Elizabeth Morrison, stood on a wooden platform as the German prisoners assembled in ragged lines. Her uniform was crisp and clean, and Greta noticed immediately that she did not look hungry. None of the Americans did. They had full faces and bright eyes and a certain ease of movement that came from bodies that were properly fed. It was the first thing every prisoner noticed about their captors. The Americans looked healthy in a way that seemed almost obscene. Captain Morrison began speaking in careful, slow English, with a translator beside her repeating everything in German. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated humanely. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter." The translator's voice was mechanical, but the words themselves seemed impossible. Adequate food. In Germany, adequate food had become a memory of a memory. Even before Greta had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps, rations had been cut again and again. First meat disappeared, then butter, then anything that could be remotely considered luxury. By 1944, even potatoes had become precious. The barracks they were led to were simple but clean. Each woman received a thin mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a metal footlocker. After months of sleeping on frozen ground or in bombed-out buildings, it felt like luxury. But what struck Greta most forcefully was what she could see through the barracks window. Beyond the barbed wire fence, she watched American soldiers walking toward what appeared to be a dining facility. They were laughing, actually laughing. When had she last heard laughter that was not edged with hysteria? Elsa sat down heavily on the bunk beside Greta's. At 31, she had been a nurse before the war, and her medical training had kept her alive when others had succumbed to dysentery and typhus. "Did you see the guards?" she murmured. "They were eating chocolate. Just standing there, eating chocolate like it was nothing." Her voice held a note of wonder and resentment. Chocolate had disappeared from Germany in 1942. The Hitler Youth had been given ersatz cocoa made from acorns and artificial sweetener. Real chocolate had become as mythical as peace itself. Through the window, Greta watched a supply truck pull up to a nearby building. American soldiers began unloading crates of food. She could see the labels even from this distance: fresh vegetables, canned goods, sacks of white flour. The sheer abundance was staggering. How could America have so much when Germany had so little? The propaganda had told them that America was suffering just as much, that the British blockade was starving everyone equally, that their enemies were just as desperate as they were. But these men carrying crates of plenty told a different story. Everything had been a lie. Greta felt something shift inside her chest. It was not quite hope. It was something more dangerous. It was the first crack in the wall of certainty she had built around herself. If they had lied about American suffering, what else had been a lie? 3 days passed in a strange limbo of cautious routine. The women were given medical examinations by a brisk American nurse who handled them with impersonal efficiency but no cruelty. They received new clothing to replace their tattered uniforms, standard-issue prison garb, but clean and whole. They were assigned work details in the camp laundry and kitchen gardens. The work was not particularly hard, not compared to the back-breaking labor they had endured in the final chaotic months of the war. But what unsettled Greta most was how ordinary everything seemed. The Americans treated them like an administrative inconvenience rather than despised enemies. On the fourth morning, Captain Morrison appeared at their barracks with an announcement. The translator, a young corporal named Schmidt, who spoke German with a slight Bavarian accent, stood at attention beside her. "Tomorrow evening," the captain began, "there will be a special dinner for all prisoners." She paused and Schmidt translated. The words hung in the air like smoke. A special dinner. The women exchanged glances heavy with suspicion and confusion. What did that mean? In German camps, a special dinner had often been code for something else entirely, a selection, a punishment disguised as kindness. Nothing was ever given freely. Greta felt her heart begin to pound. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to appear calm. Around her, she could see the same tension in every woman's shoulders. They had all learned to read between the lines of official announcements. "The meal will be served at 1800 hours in the main dining facility," Captain Morrison continued. "Attendance is mandatory." Mandatory. That word crystallized every fear. If it were truly a kindness, why would it be mandatory? Greta's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. After the captain left, the barracks erupted in hushed, frantic conversation. "It is a trick," insisted Helena, a former radio operator from Berlin. "They want to see how we react. They are testing us." Elsa shook her head. "Testing us for what? We are already prisoners. What more can they do?" But her voice lacked conviction. They all knew what more could be done. They had all heard stories. Propaganda perhaps, but also perhaps not. The uncertainty was paralyzing. That night, Greta lay awake on her thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. The woman in the bunk across from her was crying very softly, trying to muffle the sound in her blanket. Others pretended to sleep, but Greta could tell from their breathing that they were awake too. A special dinner, the words repeated in her mind like a sinister lullaby. She thought of her mother's cabbage rolls, of the life that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. She thought of the American soldiers eating chocolate like it meant nothing. She thought of the crates of food she had seen unloaded. And she thought, with a resignation that felt almost like peace, that tomorrow she would know what this special dinner truly meant. Whatever it was, she would face it. She had survived this long. She would survive one more day. Sleep would not come, so Greta let herself drift into the past. Hamburg, 1936. She had been 15 years old, standing in her mother's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon when the world still made sense. The kitchen had been small but spotlessly clean, with lace curtains filtering the autumn light into soft golden patterns across the wooden table. Her mother, Margaret, had been teaching her the family recipe for cabbage rolls, the same recipe passed down from Greta's grandmother and her grandmother before that. "The secret," her mother had said, her capable hands peeling away the outer leaves of a large green cabbage, "is patience. You cannot rush good food." She had placed the whole cabbage in a pot of boiling water, letting it soften just enough that the leaves could be separated without tearing. Greta had watched, mesmerized, as her mother's practiced fingers had worked. Each leaf had to be trimmed carefully, the thick spine shaved down so it would roll properly. The filling was a precise mixture: ground beef, rice, onions, salt, pepper, and just a hint of marjoram that made everything taste like home itself. Her father had been alive then. He would come home from his work at the shipyard, and the smell of cabbage rolls would greet him at the door. Greta could still see his face lighting up, still hear him calling out, "Margaret, you spoil me." Her mother would laugh and say, "Good food is not spoiling, Heinrich. Good food is love made visible." They would sit together at that small table, the three of them, and for those moments, everything had been perfect and safe and permanent. But nothing had been permanent. Her father had died in 1939, his heart giving out 3 months before the invasion of Poland. Greta had thought at the time that it was a tragedy. Now she understood it had been a mercy. He had not lived to see what Germany would become. He had not lived to see his daughter join the Women's Auxiliary Corps, believing the speeches about duty and homeland and necessary sacrifice. He had not lived to see Hamburg burn. The last time Greta had tasted her mother's cabbage rolls had been Christmas of 1942. By then, there was no beef. Her mother had made them with a tiny amount of horse meat and stretched the filling with extra rice and chopped carrots. They had used their saved ration coupons for weeks to gather the ingredients. The rolls had been smaller, less rich, but her mother had prepared them with the same careful love. They had sat at that table, just the two of them now, and pretended it was like the old days, pretended that the world outside was not tearing itself apart. 3 months later, Greta had been sent to France. She had written letters to her mother every week, cheerful lies about how she was fine, how the work was not too hard, how the war would be over soon. Then the letters had stopped coming back. The firebombing of Hamburg had happened in July of 1943. Greta had no way of knowing if her mother had survived, no way of knowing if that small kitchen with its lace curtains still existed, or if it had been consumed by the same flames that had devoured so much else. The next day crawled forward with agonizing slowness. The women went through their assigned duties with mechanical precision, but every conversation returned obsessively to the promised dinner. What did it mean? What would happen? The Americans who supervised their work details seemed utterly unconcerned, which only deepened the mystery. How could they be so casual about something that had every prisoner's nerves stretched to breaking? Around 1400 hours, the wind shifted, and Greta caught her first hint of what was being prepared. She had been hanging laundry on the lines behind the barracks when the smell reached her. She froze, clothespin in hand, unable to believe what her nose was telling her. Cooking meat. Not the thin, grayish broth they had been given in their daily rations, but real meat being prepared with real spices. The aroma was rich and complex, carrying notes of tomato and pepper and something else she could not quite identify, something that smelled like a memory she had locked away for safekeeping. Elsa appeared beside her, her face pale. "Do you smell that?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Greta nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Other women began drifting toward them, drawn by the same impossible scent. They stood in a small cluster, clothespins forgotten, faces turned toward the dining facility like flowers seeking sun. Helena started to cry, quiet tears rolling down her weathered cheeks. "It smells like my grandmother's kitchen," she said. "Before everything, it smells like before." The smell grew stronger as the afternoon wore on. By 1600 hours, it had permeated every corner of the camp. The women could talk of nothing else. Some insisted it must be for the American soldiers, that the prisoners would receive the same watery soup they had been getting. Others argued that the smell was too pervasive, too abundant to be for only the American staff. There were perhaps 200 American soldiers at the camp, but the smell suggested enough food for an army. Surely some of it must be intended for the prisoners. But why? The question had no answer that made sense. Greta found herself thinking of her mother's cabbage rolls again. The way the tomato sauce would simmer for hours, filling their apartment with warmth and promise. The way the rice would soften inside the meat mixture, absorbing all the flavors until each bite was a perfect balance of textures and tastes. She had not allowed herself to think about food like that in years. It hurt too much. Desire was dangerous when you had nothing. Better to forget that food could be anything other than fuel for survival. But now, with this smell wrapping itself around her like an embrace, she could not stop the memories, could not stop the longing that rose up in her chest like a physical ache. 1800 hours felt simultaneously too far away and too close. Part of her wanted to run toward whatever waited in that dining facility. Another part wanted to hide in her bunk and refuse to face whatever cruel trick this must surely be. Because it had to be a trick. Nothing good had happened to Greta in so long that she had forgotten how to recognize genuine kindness. She had only learned to recognize its absence. At 1730 hours, the women gathered in their barracks, trying to prepare themselves for whatever the evening would bring. Some had attempted to make themselves presentable, smoothing their prison-issue clothing and tying back their hair with strips of cloth. Others sat in stubborn defiance, refusing to play along with what they were certain was an elaborate humiliation. The tension was thick enough to choke on. "They want to see us grovel," Helena said, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "They will give us a feast and watch us debase ourselves for it. Then they will have photographs to send home, showing how pathetic the German prisoners are." Several women nodded in agreement. It made a certain terrible sense. Propaganda worked both ways. If Germany had lied about American suffering, surely America would lie about German dignity. But Elsa shook her head slowly. "I have been watching the Americans for 4 days now. They do not seem interested in humiliating us. They barely seem interested in us at all. They treat us like we are just another administrative task to be completed." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think perhaps they simply do not hate us the way we were told they would." "That is even more dangerous," said Frida, a former factory worker from the Ruhr. "If they do not hate us, what do they want from us?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. In their experience, kindness always came with strings attached, always came with expectations and debts that would eventually be called due. Free gifts did not exist, especially not between enemies. Greta listened to the argument swirl around her, but she found herself thinking about the American guards she had observed over the past few days. Private Jackson, who had corrected her when she called him Sir, and told her almost apologetically that only officers were called Sir. Corporal Rodriguez, who had helped one of the older prisoners carry a heavy basket of laundry without being asked. The nurse who had examined them with brisk efficiency, but had also given them each a small tin of salve for their chapped hands. These did not seem like people planning elaborate cruelties. "Perhaps," Greta said quietly, and the barracks fell silent because she so rarely spoke. "Perhaps it is simply dinner." The words sounded naive, even to her own ears, but she continued anyway. "We saw the food being unloaded. They have so much. Perhaps to them, feeding prisoners adequately is just what civilized people do." The concept felt alien, revolutionary. Germany had not fed its prisoners adequately. Germany had not fed its own people adequately. But America was not Germany. That was becoming more obvious with each passing day. "We will know soon enough," Elsa said, glancing at the clock on the wall. 17:55. 5 minutes until they would be marched to the dining facility. 5 minutes until whatever awaited them would be revealed. The women rose as one, forming into ragged lines. They had been soldiers once, after all. They knew how to march into uncertainty. They had done it before. They would do it again. Greta took her place in line, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of her mother's hands rolling cabbage leaves around seasoned meat. She thought of the smell that had tormented them all afternoon. And she thought, with the last shred of hope she possessed, that maybe, just maybe, the world still contained small kindnesses, even for prisoners, even for enemies, even for the defeated. The march to the dining facility took less than 3 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Captain Morrison and several guards escorted the 43 women across the campgrounds as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The smell grew stronger with each step, and Greta could see some of the women physically trembling. Whether from fear or anticipation or hunger, she could not tell. Perhaps all three at once. The dining facility was a long wooden building with windows running along both sides. As they approached, Greta could see movement inside, American soldiers arranging something. The doors stood open, and the aroma that wafted out was so rich, so impossibly abundant, that several women actually stopped walking. The guards had to gently encourage them forward. When they crossed the threshold, Greta felt her breath catch in her throat. The interior had been transformed. Long tables ran the length of the room, covered with white cloth. Not fancy tablecloths, just simple white fabric, but after years of eating from tin plates, while sitting on the ground or standing in crowded mess halls, the sight was startling. Each place had been set with real plates, metal utensils, and cloth napkins folded beside them. But it was what sat in the center of each table that made Greta's vision blur with tears she refused to let fall. Platters. Serving platters piled high with food. She could see them from where she stood, steam still rising from their contents. The smell of tomato sauce and cooked meat and spices filled the air so completely that breathing felt like eating. "Captain," Morrison gestured for the women to take their seats. They moved like sleepwalkers, unable to process what they were seeing. Greta found herself at a table near the middle of the room, sitting between Elsa and a young woman named Katharina, who had barely spoken since their arrival. The platter in front of them held at least 20 cabbage rolls, each one perfectly formed, swimming in rich red sauce. Greta stared at the food, her mind refusing to accept it as real. Cabbage rolls. Actual cabbage rolls made with real meat and rice, just like her mother used to make. Just like the food from before the world had broken. She could see chunks of tomato in the sauce, could see the way the cabbage leaves glistened with moisture. Her hands began to shake. Other platters held different offerings, mashed potatoes with butter melting in golden pools. Green beans that were actually green, not the gray-brown color of vegetables that had been stored too long. Fresh bread sliced and arranged in baskets, with butter pats beside them. Pitchers of what appeared to be milk sat at intervals along the tables. Helena began to sob openly. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the abundance before them. This was not prison food. This was barely even soldier food. This was the kind of meal families shared on special occasions. Captain Morrison stood at the front of the room, waiting for the women to settle. The crying had spread now, quiet weeping that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than tears. Greta kept her eyes fixed on the cabbage rolls, afraid that if she looked away, they would disappear like smoke. Afraid this was a fever dream brought on by malnutrition and exhaustion. "I know this must seem unusual," Captain Morrison began, and Corporal Schmidt translated in his careful German. "But I want to explain something to you." She paused, seeming to choose her words with deliberate care. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. That means you are entitled to the same rations as American soldiers of equivalent rank. The same food we eat, you eat." The translation washed over the room, but Greta could see the incomprehension on every face. The same food as American soldiers? This feast was what they ate regularly? It was not possible. No army could sustain itself on such abundance. There had to be a mistake or a misunderstanding. "Today's meal," the captain continued, "is cabbage rolls, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread, butter, and milk. This is standard fare in American military dining facilities." Standard fare. The words seemed to come from another language, another universe. Greta thought of the watery soup and black bread that had been standard fare in Germany. Thought of the sawdust and chestnuts mixed into flour. Thought of children with distended bellies and old people who simply stopped waking up because their bodies had nothing left to burn. One of the servers, a young American private, approached their table with a large serving spoon. He began placing cabbage rolls on the plates in front of each woman. 1 roll, 2 rolls, 3 rolls. Greta watched in disbelief as he put 3 full cabbage rolls on her plate, each one larger than her fist. Then he ladled sauce over them, rich and red and abundant. He moved to the next woman and did the same. "Is everyone served?" Captain Morrison asked. Greta looked around and saw that every woman now had a plate piled with food. More food than any of them had seen in years. More food than seemed possible. "Then please," the captain said, her voice gentle now, "eat." But no one moved. 43 women sat frozen, staring at their plates like they contained something precious and fragile that might shatter if touched. Greta could hear her own breathing, rapid and shallow, could feel her heart hammering in her chest. Elsa reached out slowly, her hand trembling, and picked up her fork. The simple metal utensil seemed to weigh nothing and everything at once. She looked at Greta, her eyes asking a question that had no words. "Is this real? Can we trust this?" Greta found herself nodding, though she had no answers. No certainty, only the desperate, terrifying hope that maybe just this once, something good was actually happening to them. The silence in the dining hall was absolute, broken only by the quiet sounds of the American servers moving through the room, ensuring every platter was full, every pitcher filled. Captain Morrison remained standing at the front, and Greta realized she was waiting, watching them, not with cruelty or amusement, but with something that looked almost like concern. "I understand your hesitation," the captain said, and Schmidt translated. "I understand that you have experienced things that make trust difficult." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "But this is not a trick. This is not propaganda. This is simply dinner." She gestured toward her own plate at a small table near the wall, where several American officers sat with identical meals. "We are eating the same food, from the same kitchen, prepared by the same cooks." Greta watched as Captain Morrison cut into one of her own cabbage rolls, took a bite, and chewed normally. Swallowed. Continued eating as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, because for her, it probably was. For Americans, this abundance was simply Tuesday evening. The realization made something crack open inside Greta's chest. "The food is yours," Captain Morrison said firmly. "No one will take it away. There is no punishment coming. There is no hidden cost." She set down her fork and looked directly at the women. "You are hungry. You have been hungry for a very long time. Please, eat." The final word hung in the air like a benediction, like permission for something they had been denied so long they had forgotten it was possible. Elsa lifted her fork to her mouth. Greta watched as she took the first bite, saw her friend's face transform, saw tears spill down her cheeks as she chewed and swallowed, saw her take another bite immediately, and then another, as if something inside her had broken free of its restraints. Around the room, other women began to eat, tentatively at first, then with increasing desperation. Greta looked down at her own plate. The 3 cabbage rolls sat there, substantial and real. Steam still rose from them in delicate spirals. The tomato sauce was thick and rich, flecked with herbs she could identify even by sight. Oregano, basil. The cabbage leaves were tender, not tough or bitter. She could see where the filling peeked through at the ends, a mixture of ground beef and rice that looked almost obscenely abundant. She picked up her fork. Her hand was shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She steadied herself, took a breath, and cut into the first cabbage roll. The fork slid through easily, the cabbage yielding to the gentlest pressure. She lifted the bite to her mouth. The smell alone was enough to make her dizzy. For a moment she hesitated, some part of her still waiting for someone to slap the fork from her hand, to laugh at her hunger, to punish her for daring to want this. But no one did. The Americans continued eating their own meals, talking quietly among themselves. They were not watching the prisoners with any particular interest. Greta placed the fork in her mouth. For a moment she simply held it there, afraid to bite down, afraid to discover this was all some elaborate illusion. Then her teeth closed on the tender cabbage and seasoned meat, and the taste exploded across her tongue like a revelation. The beef was rich and savory, cooked with onions until it had absorbed every complex flavor. The rice provided texture and substance, each grain distinct yet part of the whole. The tomato sauce carried notes of sweetness and acidity in perfect balance, with herbs that tasted like someone had actually cared about making this food delicious rather than merely sufficient. She chewed slowly, trying to make the moment last, trying to memorize every sensation. Her throat tightened with emotion as she swallowed. The food moved down her esophagus, warm and solid and real, and hit her empty stomach like an anchor finding harbor. She had forgotten that food could taste like this, had forgotten that eating could be something other than the grim business of staying alive one more day. The second bite was harder to take slowly. Her body, recognizing nourishment after years of deprivation, began screaming for more. Her hands moved faster, cutting another piece, then another. The cabbage roll disappeared in what felt like seconds. She reached for the second one, dimly aware that she should pace herself, that her shrunken stomach might rebel against this sudden abundance. But she could not stop. The taste of her mother's kitchen, the taste of home and safety, and a world that had made sense, it was all there in these simple cabbage rolls. Tears streamed down her face as she ate. She was not alone in this. Around the room, women wept openly while shoveling food into their mouths with a desperation that would have been humiliating if they had possessed any dignity left to lose. But hunger had stripped them of pride long ago. All that remained was need and the shocking miracle of that need being met. Greta finished the second cabbage roll and paused, forcing herself to slow down. Her stomach already felt fuller than it had in months, the unaccustomed sensation almost painful. She looked at the third roll on her plate, then at the platters still piled high with food in the center of the table. There was more. If she wanted another, there was more. The concept felt obscene and holy at the same time. She turned her attention to the mashed potatoes, taking a small scoop onto her fork. Real butter had been mixed into them. She could see the yellow streaks, taste the richness. In Germany, butter had been replaced by margarine, then by something that was not quite margarine, but rather a chemical approximation of fat. This was real butter, probably from real cows that had grazed on real grass in fields that had not been bombed into moonscapes. Katerina, the quiet young woman sitting beside Greta, had stopped eating after finishing one cabbage roll. She sat with her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, staring at her plate with an expression of such profound confusion that Greta reached out and touched her arm gently. "Are you all right?" she whispered in German. Katerina turned to her, and Greta saw that her eyes were unfocused, lost somewhere between past and present. "My birthday," Katerina said softly. I was turning 16. My mother made cabbage rolls just like these. It was 1941, before everything became impossible. She had saved her ration coupons for weeks to get the meat. My father played his accordion, and my little brother sang, even though he could not carry a tune. Her voice broke. That was the last time I remember being happy, really happy. Before my father was conscripted, before my brother died in the bombing, before everything. She looked around the dining hall at the other women eating with single-minded intensity, at the Americans serving food with casual abundance, at the platters that seemed to never empty no matter how much was taken from them. This feels like that birthday, she continued. This feels like when the world was still good. She turned back to Greta, tears making clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Is it someone's birthday? Did someone have a birthday and they are celebrating? Is that why there is so much food? The question hung in the air between them, innocent and heartbreaking. Before Greta could answer, Elsa leaned across from the other side. She had been listening, and her face held the same mixture of grief and wonder that Greta felt twisting in her own chest. Yes, Elsa said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. It is all our birthdays, every single one of us. This is the day we were born again. The words rippled outward from their table. Other women had heard. Helena repeated it to her neighbor. Frida passed it along. Within moments, the phrase had traveled through the dining hall like a prayer or a revelation. It is all our birthdays. Women nodded, understanding something that went deeper than words. They had been dead in every way that mattered. Dead to hope, dead to kindness, dead to the possibility that the world contained anything other than cruelty and loss. And now this impossible meal that tasted like home and memory and everything they thought they had lost forever. This food given freely by enemies who were supposed to hate them. This abundance in a world they had been told was starving equally on all sides. The lies they had been fed, the propaganda that had shaped their understanding of reality, it was all crumbling like wet paper in their hands. Greta forced herself to eat the green beans slowly, to give her stomach time to adjust to the sudden nourishment. They were tender and seasoned with butter and what tasted like almonds. Real almonds, not ersatz substitutes. Each bite required her to confront another lie she had believed. The Americans were not starving. They were not desperate. They were not the cruel, heartless monsters she had been taught to fear. They were people with enough food that they could feed their prisoners like honored guests. Across the table, Helena had stopped crying and started laughing. It was a sound that bordered on hysteria, but there was genuine mirth in it too. "Do you know what my commander told me?" she said to no one in particular. "He said the Americans were cannibals, that if we were captured, they would eat us because their food supplies had run out, that they were so desperate they had started consuming their own dead." She gestured at the platters of food, at the abundance that surrounded them. Does this look like desperation? Does this look like a country running out of food? The question needed no answer. Every woman in that room could see the truth laid out before them on white plates with cloth napkins. America had not been starving. America had been thriving. While German children had eaten bread made from sawdust and chestnuts, American soldiers had been eating cabbage rolls with real beef. While German hospitals had run out of bandages and medicine, American camps had nurses with salve for prisoners' chapped hands. The disparity was so vast, it was almost incomprehensible. "They told us we were winning," Frida said, her voice hollow. "Right up until the end, they told us Germany was winning, that our sacrifices were necessary for victory, that the Americans were on the verge of collapse." She picked up a piece of bread, held it up to the light. "This is white bread, made from real wheat, no sawdust, no substitutes, no stretching it with whatever could be ground into powder." She set it down carefully, as if it might break. "We were never winning. We were always losing, and they lied to us every single day." The realization swept through the room like a cold wind. These women had served Germany believing they were defending their homeland against enemies who threatened their very survival. They had endured hardship and danger, and the slow starvation of their own bodies because they thought it mattered, because they thought they were part of something larger and more important than themselves. But Germany had not been defending itself against starvation. Germany had been the author of its own destruction, and it had dragged its people down into the abyss while lying about the depth of the fall. Private James Jackson had been watching the German women eat with a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. He was 22 years old, from a small town in Georgia where his family ran a dairy farm. He had seen hunger before, during the worst years of the Depression, but nothing had prepared him for the way these women attacked their food, like they expected it to be taken away at any moment, like they could not quite believe it was real. One of the women at the nearest table, the tall one with the serious face who seemed to be some kind of leader among them, looked up and caught his eye. She said something in German, and Corporal Schmidt translated. She wants to know if this is special food, if we prepared something different for them than what we normally eat. Jackson felt his face flush slightly. He glanced at Captain Morrison, who nodded for him to respond. "No, ma'am," he said, and waited for Schmidt to translate. "This is just regular Wednesday dinner. Same thing we had in the enlisted men's mess an hour ago. Same thing we will have again next Wednesday probably. The cooks rotate through about a dozen different meals. Cabbage rolls are pretty common because they are easy to make in large quantities and they keep well." He paused, trying to find the right words. "This is just normal food for us." The translation caused a visible ripple through the room. Women stopped eating, forks suspended halfway to mouths, staring at him with expressions he could not quite read. The tall woman asked another question. "She asks how often you eat meat," Schmidt said. Jackson scratched the back of his neck, uncomfortable with the attention. "Most days, I guess. We get meat at least once a day, sometimes twice. Beef, pork, chicken, sometimes fish if we are near the coast. We get fresh vegetables too, and fruit when it is in season. Bread with every meal, butter, milk." He was listing items, he realized, that probably sounded like impossible luxuries to these women. Another prisoner spoke up, a smaller woman with haunted eyes. Schmidt translated. "She wants to know if there are shortages in America, if your families at home are going without so the soldiers can eat like this." Jackson thought about his mother's letters, about her complaints that sugar rationing made it hard to bake proper cakes, about his father grousing about only getting 1 pound of coffee per week instead of 2. Those had seemed like hardships at the time. Now they seemed almost embarrassing to mention. "There is rationing," he said carefully. "Some things are limited, but no one is starving. My family eats well. Better than this, honestly. My mother is a good cook, much better than the army cooks." He tried to smile, to lighten the mood, but the women were not smiling back. They were staring at him like he had just revealed something profound and terrible. "America has a lot of farmland," he continued, "a lot of food production. We grow more than we need for ourselves, so we can feed the army and send supplies to our allies too." That night, back in the barracks, Greta sat on her bunk with her stomach uncomfortably full and her mind racing. She had eaten too much, they all had, and now they were paying the price with cramping and nausea. But even through the physical discomfort, she could not stop thinking about what Private Jackson had said. Normal food, regular Wednesday dinner, the same meal they would serve again next week and the week after that. America had so much abundance that feeding prisoners like honored guests was considered routine. Elsa sat across from her, holding her midsection and looking slightly green. "I feel sick," she said, "but I would eat it all again tomorrow if they offered." She laughed weakly. "Is that terrible, that I would make myself sick again just to taste real food?" Greta shook her head. It was not terrible. It was human. They had been starved for so long that their bodies and minds were rebelling against the sudden plenty, unable to trust that it would continue, desperate to consume everything while it lasted. "I want to write to my mother," Katerina said from her bunk near the window. Her voice was small and lost. "I want to tell her about the cabbage rolls. I want to tell her that someone, somewhere, still makes them the way they are supposed to be made, with real meat and real rice and real love." She looked down at her hands. But I do not even know if she is alive to receive a letter. And if she is, what would I say? That I am eating better as a prisoner in America than she is eating free in Germany. How could I tell her that without breaking her heart? The questions settled over the barracks like a shroud. They all wanted to write letters that could never be sent. Letters that would never be believed even if they arrived. Dear Mother, the Americans feed us 3 meals a day with real meat and fresh vegetables. Dear Father, our captors treat us better than our own government ever did. Dear Sister, I am a prisoner of war and I am safer and better fed than I have been in years. The words would sound like propaganda or delusion or cruel mockery. Helena spoke from the darkness of her bunk. My daughter is 8 years old, or she was 8 when I last saw her, 2 years ago. She must be 10 now, if she is alive. Her voice cracked, but she continued. I used to save half my ration to send home to her. Even when I was so hungry I could barely stand, I thought I was helping her survive. But what if my half ration of sawdust bread and ersatz coffee did not help at all? What if she needed 10 times that much just to be healthy? She paused. What if Germany let us all starve while telling us it was necessary, while telling us everyone else was starving too? The anger in her voice was new. For days they had been numb, going through the motions of captivity with resigned acceptance. But the cabbage rolls had changed something, had cracked open a door they had kept carefully closed. Behind that door was rage, betrayal, the bitter understanding that they had been used and lied to and sacrificed for a cause that had never been as righteous as they believed. Sleep eluded Greta again that night, but this time it was not from hunger or fear. It was from the uncomfortable weight of guilt pressing down on her chest. She lay on her thin mattress, feeling the fullness in her stomach, and wondered what right she had to that feeling. Somewhere in Germany, if her mother was still alive, she was hungry, truly, desperately hungry, in a way Greta now understood she had barely begun to experience before her capture. The irony was suffocating. She had more food as a prisoner than as a free woman serving her country. Around her, she could hear the sounds of other women struggling with the same realization. Quiet weeping, restless turning. The occasional sound of someone getting up to use the latrine, their stomach rebelling against the sudden richness of the meal. They had dreamed of food like this for years, had fantasized about it during the long nights when hunger made sleep impossible. And now that they had it, they discovered it came with a price they had not anticipated. The price of understanding. In the darkness, Frida's voice spoke softly. Do we deserve this? Any of this? No one answered immediately because the question had no easy response. They had served Germany. Some of them had served willingly, enthusiastically even, believing the speeches about destiny and greatness. Some had served because they had no choice, because refusal meant punishment or death. But willing or unwilling, enthusiastic or resigned, they had all been part of the machine. They had all contributed in their own small ways to whatever Germany had become. I do not know about deserve, Elsa finally said. I only know that we are human beings who need food to survive. The Americans seem to believe that being human is enough, that even enemies deserve to be treated with basic dignity. She paused. Perhaps that is the difference between them and us. We made worthiness conditional. They make it inherent. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Germany had created categories of worthy and unworthy, human and subhuman. The propaganda had been explicit about this. Aryans were worthy. Others were not. Citizens who served the state were worthy. Those who resisted were not. But America, at least from what these women had witnessed so far, seemed to operate on a different principle. They fed prisoners of war not because those prisoners had earned it or proved their worthiness, but simply because they were prisoners of war and the Geneva Convention said they should be fed. It was a bureaucratic kindness, perhaps, but it was kindness nonetheless, and it was applied equally, without apparent judgment about whether the recipients deserved it. Greta thought about the moment Captain Morrison had said, "Please eat." not as a command, but as an invitation, as if the women's comfort and nourishment mattered for their own sake, not because it served some larger strategic purpose. When had anyone last cared about Greta's comfort? When had her well-being been valuable simply because she was a human being, and not because of what she could contribute to the war effort? Morning came with weak sunlight filtering through the barracks windows and the smell of coffee drifting from the direction of the mess hall. Real coffee, Greta realized, not the acorn and chicory mixture that Germany had been calling coffee for the past 3 years. She rose slowly, her stomach still tender from the previous night's feast, and joined the other women in preparing for morning roll call. They moved with a different energy today. Something had shifted in the night. Some fundamental understanding had realigned. At breakfast, they were served oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins, toast with butter and jam, scrambled eggs and bacon. The bacon made several women gasp audibly. Pork had disappeared from German tables years ago, reserved first for the military, and then vanishing entirely as supplies dwindled. Here it was presented casually, alongside generous portions of everything else, as if meat for breakfast was perfectly ordinary, which Greta was beginning to understand it was. For Americans, this was their normal. Captain Morrison appeared during the meal, moving between tables with Corporal Schmidt at her side. She stopped at Greta's table and addressed them directly. "I wanted to speak with you about yesterday's dinner," she said, waiting for the translation. "I understand it was overwhelming, that the amount of food was unexpected." The women nodded, uncertain where this was leading. "I want you to understand that this is not temporary. This is not a special occasion. You will receive 3 meals a day, every day, of similar quality and quantity. This is the standard we maintain for all prisoners under our care." The words were clear, but their meaning took time to penetrate. Every day, 3 meals, the same abundance, not as a reward or a special occasion, but as the baseline expectation. Greta felt something loosening in her chest, some tightly wound spring of anxiety beginning to uncoil. If this was true, if they could trust this, then survival was no longer the daily struggle it had been for so long. They could think about something other than where their next meal would come from. "There is something else I want to discuss," Captain Morrison continued. "We have been receiving reports from Germany, from the camps that Allied forces are liberating as they advance." Her expression grew somber. "Some of you may have heard rumors about concentration camps, about what was being done there. I am here to tell you that the rumors are true, and they are worse than anything you can imagine." She paused, letting Schmidt translate, watching the women's faces carefully. "In the coming days, we will be showing you photographs and newsreel footage, not to punish you, but because we believe you have a right to know what was done in your country's name." The announcement fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of dread through the assembled women. They had heard whispers, yes, rumors about camps that were not prisoner of war camps, but something else entirely, something darker. But rumors were easy to dismiss as enemy propaganda. Photographs would be harder to deny. The cabbage rolls suddenly felt heavy in Greta's stomach for an entirely different reason. 3 weeks passed in a strange new rhythm. The women worked their assigned duties, ate their 3 abundant meals each day, and slowly began to put on weight. Hollow cheeks filled out. Protruding ribs became less visible beneath their clothing. Their bodies were healing from years of deprivation, even as their minds struggled with what Captain Morrison had shown them. The photographs from Dachau and Buchenwald, the newsreel footage of skeletal prisoners stumbling toward liberation, the mass graves, the gas chambers disguised as showers. Some of the women had refused to believe it at first, insisted it must be fabricated propaganda designed to break their spirits. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Germany had not merely waged war, it had committed atrocities that defied comprehension, and they, in their small ways, had been part of the system that enabled it. They had believed the speeches about defending the homeland, about Germany's rightful place in the world. They had believed they were serving something noble. The cabbage rolls tasted different now. Though they were prepared the same way each Wednesday, they tasted like shame and unworthiness. Letters had begun arriving from Germany, filtered through the International Red Cross. Greta's came on a Thursday morning, her mother's handwriting barely recognizable, shaky and uneven. Her mother was alive. Hamburg was ruins. They were living in the basement of what had once been an apartment building, sharing space with 11 other families. Food was scarce beyond imagination. A potato was a treasure. A piece of bread was a feast. Her mother's letter asked about conditions in the American camp, asked if Greta was being treated humanely, asked when she might come home. Greta held the letter and could not bring herself to respond. How could she tell her mother the truth? That she ate beef and fresh vegetables 3 times a day? That she slept on a mattress with 2 blankets? That her American captors treated her with more dignity than her own government ever had? The words would read like a cruel joke or a delusion. And beneath those truths lay a darker one. Greta was not certain she wanted to go home. The thought had been growing in her mind for days now, frightening and liberating in equal measure. Other women were receiving similar letters or no letters at all. Some had lost everything and everyone. Others faced the prospect of returning to devastation and hunger, to a country that would view them with suspicion for having been captured, for having survived when so many had not, for having been fed by the enemy while Germans starved. The accusations would be unspoken but present in every glance. You ate American food while we suffered. You were comfortable while we froze in basements. You were safe while our cities burned. Captain Morrison had mentioned, almost casually during one morning formation, that some prisoners in other camps had applied for permission to remain in America after the war, that sponsors could be found, that there might be possibilities for those who could not or would not return to Germany. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, October 9, 1973. Greta Henderson stood in her bright suburban kitchen, laying out ingredients on the counter with practiced precision. A large green cabbage, 2 pounds of ground beef, a container of rice, onions, tomatoes, and the small collection of spices that transformed simple ingredients into memory itself. Her granddaughter Amy, aged 12, sat at the kitchen table doing homework, but watching her grandmother with the patient attention of a child who knew something important was about to be shared. "Oma," Amy said, using the German word for grandmother that Greta had taught her, "why do you always make cabbage rolls on Wednesdays?" It was a good question, one that deserved a real answer. Greta set down the knife she had been using to trim the cabbage and turned to face her granddaughter. Where to begin? How to explain to a child born into abundance what it meant to have survived its opposite? "When I was about twice your age," Greta began, her English still carrying the accent of her homeland after nearly 30 years in America, "I was very far from home. I was a prisoner of war in Mississippi. I was hungry all the time. Not just hungry like you feel before dinner, hungry in a way that makes you forget what not being hungry feels like." Amy's eyes widened, but she stayed quiet, sensing the weight of what was being shared. One Wednesday evening, the Americans served us cabbage rolls, real ones, made with beef and rice, just like my mother used to make in Hamburg. I thought it was a special occasion, a birthday maybe, but a guard told me it was just regular Wednesday dinner, that they ate food like that all the time. Greta paused, remembering that moment in the dining hall, the taste of revelation. That was when I understood that everything I had believed about America was wrong, and that meant everything I had believed about Germany might be wrong too. She began to work the cabbage again, separating the softened leaves with gentle care. Those cabbage rolls were more than food, Amy. They were proof that people who were supposed to be my enemies could show me more kindness than my own government ever did. They were the reason I chose to stay here, to build a life in this country instead of returning to the ruins of my old one. She looked up, meeting her granddaughter's eyes. And that is why we make them every Wednesday, to remember, to honor that moment when everything changed, when I learned that home is not always where you come from. Sometimes it is where you choose to be. Amy came to stand beside her grandmother, watching as the cabbage rolls took shape. "Will you teach me?" she asked. Greta smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling with joy. "Yes, Liebchen, I will teach you. And someday you will teach your own children, and the recipe will continue, along with the story of why it matters."